Hello again. Here is now part 1.4 of General Introduction to Tax Law, and that is going to deal with how to work with the law, as we have seen already that the law is vital for defining taxes, and so that's our topic for this. If the law is so important for us, if we deal with taxation, then it's a clear thing that we should first have a glance to who has the right to make a law, how do laws be made, be generated, and so on, and how do you deal with them. In principle, or in general, there is the idea that the state has up to three, or mainly up to three different kinds of powers. There is legislative power, so the power to give a law, the executive power, that is the authority to carry through what the law demands, and the juridical power, so to decide legal matters in court if there are disputes. Now, especially that also plays a role for dealing with tax laws. So the first interesting question should be, in every state, who has the right to make laws, especially the tax laws. In most countries, this is defined by a written framework, the Constitution, which gives powers to Parliament, powers to the head of state, and powers to others. And to overrule that constitution is normally not possible, so Parliament has to remain within the limits which are drawn for its legislation by that constitution. Very often you have limits to parliamentary law giving power, which are set by the rights of the individual, which are granted in such a constitution. For example, that ownership is protected or is guaranteed, or that possible restrictions of these rights, like ownership, are also limited by the Constitution. So Constitution usually says what can be done with respect to the individual rights by law and what is not possible. So the first consequence from such a constitution is usually that the legislating bodies, parliament or so, cannot create any tax rule which they want, but they have to remain within the limits set by that constitution. Nevertheless, as the constitution usually only defines a range of possible laws and only sets limits, within that range you still have, as a parliament, a huge amount of possibilities. In Germany, just to bring that as an example, the power to legislate is attributed to more than one single level of the federation, because Germany is organized as a federation of several entities, and each level of the federation has the right to issue and create laws. But the German constitution, which limits these possibilities for the individual bodies, is the basic law, or called Grundgesetz, or GG as the official abbreviation is. Especially the German constitution then says you have certain property rights. So your property cannot be taken away from you without any justification, and it can only be taken away in the favor of the public if there are really, really compelling grounds, and even then you have the right to compensation or so. Restrictions of the property rights are only possible on the grounds of a law. So here we again see taking away your money without giving you anything in return. That is an especially hard restriction, or inflict a hard restriction to your rights of ownership. That is only possible if there is a law, and the state laws have to respect that, so they cannot take away your property without justification, and they are also not allowed to deprive ownership of any sense. So the basic core of ownership rights must be kept up. Taxes are explicitly allowed, so that's a deviation from that protection of property. Each level of the federation has the right to invent and levy taxes. Now that might end up in a chaos because everybody taxes everything, and so there is a kind of collision rule. What happens if several levels intend to tax the same thing? The rule is clear and simple. Whatever is taxed by a higher level is immune against taxation by the lower ones. So the lower levels, that is in Germany the municipalities, so the cities, or the federation states, which are called the laender, can only levy a tax on things which are not yet taxed by the federation, so by the higher level. The Constitution also says that tax revenue is either for the body which invented and levies the tax, or that the tax revenue must be shared with other levels of the federation. That is then a so-called shared tax or Gemeinschaftssteuer. For example, the very important value-added tax, the tax on the revenue, the turnover of the business owner, is such a shared tax. The income and corporation tax are also shared taxes. So if you pay your income tax on your wages here in Germany, then you can be sure that you also pay something for the city where you live in, although you do not see that directly because the income tax is levied as one single amount at an individual, no, at the same or at one single rate from everybody. But then internally, the state institutions divide the money among themselves according to what they need and what has been fixed by legislation. Now, the income tax and corporation tax and trade tax in Germany are made on the level of the federation. So these are the most important taxes, and that brings up the question, who has the right to legislate for the federation? That is in Germany, as we have a two-chamber parliament, the federal parliament, the Bundestag, and sometimes it also needs the consent of the other chamber, the representation for the laender, that is the Federal Council or Bundesrat. They must consent in all cases of all shared taxes, because otherwise the Bundestag, the federation representation, would have the right to decide on those taxes alone from which the laender mostly live. And that is the reason why, naturally, the federal parliament cannot legislate on these shared taxes without the consent of the Bundesrat, the Federation Council. The legislation on the value-added tax, so the tax on turnover, is something special, because here officially the right to legislate lies still with the federal parliament and with consent of Federal Council. So officially the normal rules apply, but unofficially, or in a, let's say, undercover way, the federal institution there have to legislate according to the orders of the European Union, because the European Union has, under the treaty which found the European Union, has got the right to give binding orders to its member states, how they have to legislate, or that they have to follow certain orders when they legislate on economical aspects and on everything which is relevant for economy. And value-added tax is traditionally a field where the European Union issues a mass of very concrete and detailed orders. So here the legislation on value-added tax is approximately with 90% or even more identical in all the member states of the EU, so that here in practice the federal parliament writes the law but has to write that in the law which the EU demands. So that means we also will have to be interested in the legislating powers of the EU and the way how European Union law works and how it can be enforced. The next question, when you once have these laws, is how you can execute them. So you cannot write into a law that Mr. Smith has to pay 100 euro and Mrs. Müller has to pay 200. So you have to lay down general rules, usually in form of if-then rules. So if somebody has a total income of, let's say, 10,000 euro a year, then that person's annual income tax shall be 500 euro. So these general rules then must be naturally applied to the individual cases. So the fiscal office then has to check who fulfills that condition. I have an annual income of 10,000, then to write them a letter, you owe us 500, and then collect the money. This is done by the authorities, so the executive branch of the state, the institutions which execute the laws are called the authorities. And in Germany, that is, for example, at the lowest level, the city level, where you live, the Finanzamt. So one could call it fiscal office or local fiscal office. Nevertheless, I prefer the rather general translation, the fiscal authority, because that has the charming effect that you can use the same abbreviation for fiscal authority, namely FA, which also your Germans would probably use for Finanzamt. And I think that's an advantage of that translation, which outweighs any other arguments. So fiscal authority gives you a right idea of what it's about, and then you can use the same abbreviation. I think that's great, especially when you deal with Germans. You don't shock them by a deviating abbreviation. So I think we prefer that too. And naturally, if we just deal with tax cases, normally we are not interested in the details of which part of the fiscal authorities deals with which concrete detail of the matter. Now, the most interesting thing, naturally, which we have to deal with, or what we have to know to apply the law, is what has happened in the outside world. So we must get the data, what happened. For example, such rules like if you have an income of 1,000 euro, then you owe us 500 euro. If you had an annual income of 200,000, then you owe us, let's say, 70,000 euro. All these rules are worthless if we don't know who had 1,000 euro and who had 70,000. So the data must be collected and then transformed into an individual decision sent to these people. How many taxes do you have to pay? And the fiscal office have to obtain the necessary information, and usually that is done by asking the taxpayers. So usually you have the right, not the right, but the duty to hand in a tax declaration where you inform the fiscal office of what has been the case, and then they apply the rule to your individual situation and inform you what you have to pay. Now, naturally, it is not a very big surprise that people might feel the temptation to inform the fiscal office wrongly. Imagine I had an income of 200,000, but I think it might be a good idea to write them my income was only 10,000. Then they would be misguided, and on the basis of that wrong information, they would assess me wrongly and demand only 500. So if the fiscal authorities do not get the true facts, then the rules are applied wrongly. Everything seems to be fine for you. And then in the end, however, the tax determination, the assessment of the taxes, goes wrong because we are no longer taxed in line with what the law says, but based on wrong assumptions. So fairness of taxation, equality of taxation is no longer guaranteed. So as the fiscal authorities need the information, and there is the temptation that you could lie, it's naturally not surprising that lying to the fiscal authorities on such matters is then gravely punished. So we must think about which consequences that should have. Imagine we have, let's say, 100 people always giving honest information to the fiscal authorities. So 100 people declaring I have an annual income of 100,000. By the way, that would be nice. And they all have to pay 30,000. Then somebody else declares only 10,000, gets away with 500, although he or she would also have to pay 30,000. That is not big fun for the others, so they will be enormously angry, especially if they begin to calculate and say, oh, imagine half of the population lied and got away with that. Then if everybody of us would have said the truth, then the state would have been contented with 15,000 from all of us, instead of demanding 30,000 from the honest half of the population and nearly nothing from the lying half of the population. So lying to tax is usually a grave criminal offense under the laws of a state because it entails massive additional payments for the other half of the population, and it endangers the very functioning of the state because it endangers the fiscal or monetary basis of the state's activities. So it is highly important to have a look what will be punished. And for example, as giving the wrong information is that thing which endangers the correct application of the rules, lying or hiding information or deceiving the fiscal authorities is usually the point which they do not tolerate. Naturally, if you lie to them, and that entails a higher tax than correct, they would probably just regard you as an idiot and don't complain. For example, if you had an annual income of 100,000 and boast of having an income of 500,000, okay, then you get a big ticket, a big tax notice, and nobody would complain about that. So to make it a crime, lying, hiding information, or deceiving the fiscal authorities should be combined with a financial advantage. Yeah. Then this is usually then regarded as a criminal offense in most countries, called tax fraud in Germany, Steuerhinterziehung in German, or an alternative term would be tax evasion, which is also mostly used for the criminal behavior which you can find. So that seems to be clear. Here we have the legal basis for that definition of that tax fraud crime. It's again written down in the General Tax Code, the Abgabenordnung, which we already have seen. You remember that paragraph 3 of the AO was the definition of what a tax is. Now here we have the general rule for what happens with tax fraud and what is tax fraud. They threaten you with imprisonment up to 5 years or a punishment payment, a fine, If you did the following thing, if you gave wrong or incomplete information to the fiscal authorities, in cases where you had to give information, where you have hidden information, and this then entailed a non-justified tax advantage. An unwritten additional condition is, as with every criminal offense, that you acted on purpose, so with the intention to break the law, or that you did that thing, providing wrong information, intentionally, so that you knew you were lying and that had a tax implication. So we have three conditions for tax fraud: hiding information or giving wrong information, achieving a tax advantage for that, and acting on purpose. Interesting enough is the last sentence here in the first subparagraph. If this leads to a non-justified tax advantage, it does not matter if that leads to a lower tax for you or for somebody else. So giving wrong information to the fiscal authorities is even a crime if you don't lie in your own interest but just want to help somebody else. That makes sense, because otherwise we all would lie to help others, and so nobody would pay the correct tax. The attempt to commit tax fraud is also a criminal offense, and you can already be punished for the attempt. Well, that's not a big surprise. In many other cases, that's the case too. For example, attempted murder. No, you don't get away with that for free. In grave cases, you can even be sent to prison between 6 months and 10 years. The nice thing is here that if that is a grave or hard case of tax fraud, then it's not possible to get away with a mere monetary fine. Then a prison sentence is unavoidable. Now, usually people think, if they have never been confronted with that situation or never really thought about it, that 5 years in prison or 1 year in prison or 6 months in prison, what is that? Then you can only help your imagination by just imagining a situation where you sit in your own room at home and are not allowed to leave that room for 6 months, for a year or so, and that the only leisure time which you have where it's allowed to leave your rooms is 30 minutes a day, where you can have a walk in the street directly in front of your house. That, if you imagine that, how that might feel, that gives you a relative concrete idea of how a prison sentence will impact your life. You will probably get mad if you really exactly imagine how that would feel. So, in contrast to what one might think, 5 years prison, that is rather hard, and you must add that naturally, if you were sent to prison, naturally afterwards your whole friends will avoid you, and you will get some new friends in prison which you do not really want to keep, but they want probably to keep friendship with you, and so your whole life will be changing and your career will be completely ruined. So that should be warning enough. Nobody who deals with taxes should ever be tempted to come near the suspicion of tax fraud at all. So that's the most basic message for all people who have to do with tax advising, and all merchants and all business people. There is one red line: never come near at all to the line where tax fraud might begin, and that means never give in to the temptation to hide facts from the fiscal administration, to inform them wrongly, or to try to deceive them about the things which happened. The other criteria, for example, if you acted intentionally, beginners sometimes think that is something which can save them, because who can ever prove that they acted intentionally? But in real life, the thing is that the judge will have to form in the end an opinion of if you did what you did intentionally or not. And the judge is used to a mass of people showing up in front of him every day and always bringing forward, I had no bad intentions, I had no intentions at all, I didn't know what I was doing. And no judge will ever believe you that. So when it comes to the situation that your case depends on what the judge thinks of your intentions, you are in practice already lost. The only thing you can do in order to be safe against the reproach of tax fraud is that you never lie or hide information from the fiscal authorities. Always disclose fully what has been done, and then leave them to draw the right conclusions from that and to apply the rules and the tax laws to your case and calculate the right tax. Every other thing is far too dangerous. That is something which you definitively must know. So we have three conditions: not telling the truth, achieving a tax advantage, and acting on purpose. And you see the central one is the first one. Yeah? Good. Now, in cases where a judge really, although that is a person who always makes negative experience with human character, yeah? All criminal people showing up in front of that guy or woman, if you really convince a judge that it might not have been intention, then there are some subsidiary rules. For example, if the judge thinks, okay, it might be that you did not act on purpose, but you showed a nearly criminal negligence of care, or a really intolerable amount of idiotic carelessness, then you can be punished for that carelessness and neglect. Then prison is out, but then a fine up to 50,000 euro comes in. So you will not walk away free. There's sort of everything, and for everything for every person they can do something, to say it ironically. Even for people who help others, or by falsifying documents or issuing documents with the wrong contents, there is something. So if somebody gives you a bill, an invoice or so, with the wrong contents, which can then be used for the fiscal administration to deceive them, then already that can be punished with up to 5,000 euro. And in other states, as the problem is the same, the legal rules can only be correctly applied if the fiscal authorities know what happened. Also for other states, not only for Germany, there is a grave problem if the people lie. So also in these other states, you will have consequences in criminal law if people lie or try to deceive the fiscal authorities. For example, I don't know if you have heard that in several southern European countries, you have to demand a cash receipt, an invoice, from the waiter in a restaurant. And if you don't take that bill outside the restaurant, but leave it on the table, then the waiter has the possibility to let it vanish from the bookkeeping. And that is, or has been so frequent in some countries, that it has been made a criminal offense. If a customer in a restaurant there does not demand a written bill, a written invoice, does not take it out from the restaurant, so that the waiter must expect that the fiscal authorities might find that document in the hands of a customer during an inspection or so. So if you don't take it outside the restaurant with you, then you will be punished already for that. That's their variant of, or one variant in countries of punishing endangerment of taxation. So the details may be different, but the reaction to the problems will always be there, although perhaps in one country is more strict, in another country not completely strict, depending on how much generosity they think they can afford, but they will always react to that. So basically, be aware of never doing such things. Yeah? How can they obtain the information? Naturally, they ask you or they ask others, and as lying or hiding information is a punishable offense, people usually try to answer honestly, because you have already seen, or you can now imagine, that if they can find out that you lied to them, they don't see it as fun, and they will spoil the fun for you. They will draw grave consequences. So if they send you a form which you have to fill out with prepared questions, then you will have to answer the questions honestly, send them back, and they work on it. Such forms are usually called tax returns. You know, it's a printed form which you have to fill out. And as somebody explained to me some 10 or 20 years ago, these things are called tax returns, or such a form is called return, because in England, where the term was coined, the authorities had the custom to print on this paper the word return, so send it back. And so the citizens who got that form then said, that form seems to be called return because the headline on the firm is return. So they said this, they took this for the technical term of what the paper is called, and then indeed after a while that what began to become the official term for such documents, a tax return or a tax declaration form. Yeah, so let's sum up a bit. If the conditions of a tax law are fulfilled, you have to pay. If not, you have not to pay. What does that mean for us? That means that the conditions of the law are vital for the treatment of the tax case. So naturally, that also means reading that law exactly becomes very, very important for everything you can do. If a law clearly says, if blah blah, you have an annual income of 100,000, you have to pay, let's say, 30,000 as income tax, then becomes vital for the treatment of the case what is meant by annual income. How have the 100,000 to be computed, and so on. And all these things then become important. So the exact reading or meaning of the law becomes the central affair, the central thing to work with. And that, by the way, is the reason why most tax experts, and also you and me, will always have to talk about the exact contents of a law. What does the law say? What does it not say? And if that's not perfectly clear, we need methods how to clear up what is really meant and said by the law. So we will have to think about how can we interpret the sentences in a law correctly. Furthermore, if several opinions can be brought forward reasonably on what the law might mean, you need somebody who decides the dispute. Now it's a clear thing. If you leave that task to the fiscal authorities, then it would be clear how every dispute would end. Citizen says, fiscal authorities, I interpret the law differently from you. I think in my case, the rule does not apply. I do not owe you money. Fiscal authority says, oh, we read the law differently. You have to. So in that case, not the law would decide, but what the fiscal authorities do with the law. Naturally, they would have a bias in reading the law. They would probably interpret things into the law which no reasonable person could ever have expected. So when it comes to a dispute, you need a neutral person to decide what the law really says. And that is the reason why the juridical matters, decision about disputes between the taxpayer and the fiscal authorities, must always be given to a neutral instance, so to a court. Good. So when it comes to dealing with the law, that leaves us with two important points. First, we must know how to read and interpret a law correctly. And second, if disputes are possible, we should know about the organization of the courts and how you can involve them in the matters and what can be done wrongly there. Good. Well, let's talk about how do you interpret things written in a law. First, surprising, the exact wording counts. So you cannot say they wrote something and they didn't mean it. Everybody knows that especially tax laws are of high importance for the fiscal welfare or financial welfare of the citizens. And so one can and must demand that the people who wrote that law properly thought about what they were saying. You must imagine some experts of a ministry of the government or somebody else took great care to develop and draft a text. They debated about the right wording, and then 500 or 600 people, the members of parliament, discussed it and then voted on it. You cannot say all these people were idiots, they wrote down A, but they meant B. That's not possible. So the exact wording of a text must be assumed to be correct, that this is what they meant. That can come down to very small details. For example, the German law contains a rule that persons are subjected to unlimited tax liability. We will later learn what that is. That they are subjected to unlimited tax liability if they have a residence in Germany. Now, several people have brought up in the course of history the question, what should happen if a person has two homes? A residence is a home. Now, if you have one home in Germany and a second home in France, and the French home is even your primary home, your German home is only used, let's say, 6 weeks in a year. Well, would that then mean that the rule applies with that unlimited tax liability or not? And the answer is, the text speaks of having a residence in Germany and not of the residence in Germany. If it were the residence, then everybody could have logically only one, because the means one, the only. And then the primary residence would evidently be meant, but a residence means one of several. So one residence, even a secondary residence, is sufficient to trigger unlimited tax liability. And the assumption is simply everybody familiar with the German language knows the difference between the articles a and the. And you can't really bring forward that 600 people in parliament and the experts in the ministry who prepared the draft and all the others mistook the meaning of a residence and the residence for each other. So the wording is clear enough there. And the natural assumption is, as they wrote a residence, they didn't mean the residence. So one residence is sufficient, even if it's a secondary one. So a single word can decide your fate. So you must read the wording properly. The second aspect is the context. Sometimes words have different meanings. For example, value-added tax is to be paid by persons who independently run a business. For a business owner, a so-called entrepreneur, must be independent. The idea is you shall exclude, or you want to exclude, the employees. Good. Now you could also bring forward, independent means that you must be sovereign, a member of the United Nations, and not a colony. That's evidently one of the meanings of the word independent. Now the context is clear here. That can't be meant. A merchant running a shop in Bavaria cannot be independent in the sense of no citizen but an independent state. So the contents often restricts the potential meaning of words. Sometimes it might be that disagreements or different opinions might be possible. Sometimes people also come forward with very strange understandings of a word taken from a completely different context, because naturally when they fight with the fiscal office, if they have to pay 2 million or not, then some people have a tendency to like rather strange opinions. Naturally, the context would then help to decide what the legislator had in mind. Very often it can also be an argument to say that interpreting a certain word in a certain way would fit into the whole design of the law very well, or it would perhaps be possible, but would ruin the whole system of that law. For example, there has also been in value-added tax decades ago a famous debate if somebody who opens up a bank account in a bank is acting as an entrepreneur in that function, because the definition for an entrepreneur was somebody who independently, so not under the order of a boss, does something, renders a service, and gets paid for that. And now if you and me open a bank account in a bank, we act independently because we do that not on command of a boss. We render a service to the bank because we lend them our money and they pay us for that. So somebody said the wording of the text might cover that person as an entrepreneur. In the context, there is no big argument, but the whole system of that value-added tax law would then break down. That can't be meant, because value-added tax is meant as a tax which is only to be paid by the business people and not by everyone in the population. And so the courts used that argument as an argument to say, yeah, that is not what the legislator had in mind. The whole system and design of that law is an argument against this too literal interpretation. Nobody would really understand or classify the holder as a bank account as an entrepreneur. And although one might regard it as possible if one looks to the criteria describing the word entrepreneur in the law, that cannot have been meant because it does not fit into the system. Sometimes, it might also be interesting to say what were the ideas of the persons who made that law when it was made. Because interpreting a law does constitute nothing else than to find out what the law wants to say. So the question is legitimate if you want to find out what some law wants to say. What did the legislator have in mind? And so naturally you might go to an archive or so and look up which intentions are documented for the authors of the text. What did they have in mind? This is a rather an interpretation method of a rather low rank, because the argument is usually the people who made the draft for the law were employees of a ministry, civil servants, and then that law draft was passed on to the government, and then it was passed on to the members of parliament. They debated it and voted against or for it. And so these 500 people or so who naturally in the end made the decision, these 500 people who really had the power to give the order, this is meant as a law. It's questionable if these 500 people voted with yes or no on that text with the motives which the authors of the draft had in mind. So very often it's rather a kind of a subsidiary or emergency situation argument. If you cannot clarify the intention of the law by the other methods, then you can have a look into the historical intention. Nevertheless, there are cases where, for example, very often in Germany, where the people who write a draft of a law then also present, in addition to that draft text, a paper in which they give an outline of what their motives were. In that case, naturally, one can say, if the members of parliament did not speak against these motives, it might be that they accepted the draft text for the same motives as the writers of that text had. But it might be a critical thing. Yeah? And in the end, one might also argue with the general aims of the legislator in order to decide between different interpretation possibilities. For example, if somebody says we have to choose between two potential interpretations of a law, one of them leads to, let's say, a complete breakdown of civil rights in everyday life. That civil rights are turned into a sham because for tax reasons you can no longer use them properly. Or the other interpretation would lead to no harm done to these things. Then one might argue the aims of the legislating bodies cannot have been to endanger and abolish in a hidden way all these civil freedoms. Or one might say here the text of the law taken literally leads to consequences which can never have been wanted by the legislating body because it contradicts the known overall aims of that tax law or of the legislating bodies. And so we have up to 5 traditional methods how you can argue about the potential meaning of a law. And naturally, you can very often find arguments from the one or other method and contradictory arguments from the other ones. And so in the end, sometimes you need a court decision what has really been meant. Good. A good example for the literal interpretation of a text, and that the wording of a text is the limit for every interpretation, is a specific tax in Germany, often levied by the cities, a tax on dogs, the so-called Hundesteuer. Who is the holder of a dog in Germany usually has to pay an annual tax of, I don't know, some 100 or 200 euro per year to that city. Now, imagine a tax officer meets somebody who has not 20 dogs, or not one single dog, but 20 horses. The justification on the dog for the dog tax is, among others, that who can afford a dog is well off, and it's an unnecessary luxury. It produces some harm to the environment, and so now a tax officer might come to the conclusion somebody who has 20 horses is far richer than somebody who has one dog and who keeps 20 horses, wastes far more money in an unnecessary way than somebody holding one dog. And the harm done to the environment and the streets might also be higher. So that tax officer might come to the conclusion such a person should also deserve to pay a tax. Now the answer is nevertheless clear. The dog tax law only speaks of persons who have a dog. The members of parliament knew that dogs exist, but that also cats, horses, and lions exist, and they didn't mention these animals in the tax law. So either they have been complete idiots, or they knew about the thing and decided that on purpose that they only wanted to demand a tax from the holder of dogs. So, consequence, the assumption has to be that the writer of the law knew what they were doing, and so people who own horses are out of the scope of that tax because there is no potential way which one can imagine that writing about dogs you also want to speak about horses. That would be entirely impossible, and so it's clearly excluded. The dog tax can only be levied on dogs. Now you could say it would be just and fair to levy a tax on horses too. Yes, that can be introduced by Parliament, but up to now Parliament has not done it. So punish them in the next election and vote for people who want to introduce a tax on horses. If that is not done, you just have to respect that up to now the laws do not contain the possibility to levy dog tax on horses. The wording is clear, and that by that the tax is impossible. That has important consequences for what tax advisors do to give advice to people. For example, if a person wants to buy a pet animal, you can buy a cat or a dog. Now this person could learn about the dog tax and then say, I buy a cat. Now that person might even train the cat to bark like a dog, to feed itself from frolic like a dog, to behave like a dog, and nevertheless it would not be possible to tax that pet with dog tax. So that would be avoiding the tax in a legal way, because only as a holder of a dog you would be taxed according to the wording of the law. There is no possibility to tax somebody who has a cat which believes it is a dog. On the other hand, if you now have a dog and train that dog to behave like a cat, to go fishing, um, to say meow, and behave in every way like a cat, that would not help you to avoid the dog tax, because every person familiar with biology would throw a short glance on the dog and say this is a dog. And so that wouldn't help you. There is also a tax on beer. If you want to avoid paying the beer tax, then there is a clear recommendation. Drink milk. You can even say, I do this only out of sheer protest against taxation of beer. Well, you do not have to pay the beer tax, because what you drink is not beer. You substitute milk for beer, but it's really clear that the word beer does not cover milk and people who drink milk, so you avoided that tax. So that's entirely legal. The rules decide about your taxation, and the rules are clear. You did not fulfill the if clause if somebody drinks beer. Then. Now the question is that morally legitimate to avoid the tax? And the answer is yes. Because if Parliament steals your money, and they also want to steal the money in a situation which they didn't even mention in the text, you have at least one justified expectation. Ladies and gentlemen, if you want to deprive me of your money, you could at least be careful and say clearly what you want. Well, and it can't be that if you don't bother to name beer and milk, and don't bother to name cats and dogs, that afterwards you come and say, by a dog we also mean a cat, and by beer we also mean milk. If you then want to tax that too, that is a legitimate idea. Well, if by my behavior you come to the idea we should also pay tax the people who drink milk or tax the people who have a cat, then you can introduce a tax law or change the existing law by naming both. But until you do that, I have a right to assume that you are not idiots and that you exactly mean what you said in the law. So I didn't do that, so I didn't trigger a tax. By the way, it's not even morally legitimate, but it's also positive, because if people avoid a tax by just not fulfilling the conditions of a law, that either leads to the abolishment of an unfair tax, because the last people who remain paying that tax by not avoiding it will feel unfairly treated, and so will vote against or will vote for the abolition of that tax. Or other alternative, the legislating bodies will see that everybody escapes through that loophole and say, we either abolish the tax or we extend it to cover the other alternative. So in the long run, what you do is just you contribute to the to a good evolution of the tax laws. Good. Now there is one thing. If you have just seen that if you do not fulfill an if clause of a tax, you are out of scope of that tax. Condition not fulfilled, consequence doesn't happen. Has no dog, doesn't need to pay. Now, it might be a temptation to avoid the conditions named in the law in a way that indirectly you do exactly the same. For example, if the value-added tax law says a merchant who sells a book has to give 7% VAT to the state for the sale of the book. Now you might come to a very clever idea. I don't sell my book. I choose another alternative. I give you this book as a gift for free, but under the condition that you make me a present of 10 euro in cash. Then I can say, well, I didn't sell it. That was not a sales contract. It was a donation under a condition. Formally, that's something different, but, well, if you are not just mentally ill, you will see the formalities have been different, but what you did in reality was nothing different, was different in no aspect which counts from what the law mentioned. This is in reality a full equivalent of what the law mentioned by the word sale. No? It was a book, you gave it away, you got something in return. Okay, the formalities were a bit strange. Now you could say, I did not that what the law mentioned. But there is also only one potential and explicable motive behind that strange way. You wanted to avoid that word mentioned in the law. Huh? So you substituted a sale by a different formal way, which in the final effect was exactly the same. Only the word was missing. That is not avoiding the conditions of the law, that is fulfilling them, although you avoided the formalities. So that is called an abusive behavior. Tax abuse means you avoid the things mentioned in the law, but basically what you do is exactly the same, only some unimportant formalities are changed. Yeah. Every sane person would have directly done what is mentioned in the law. Your deviation, your different way is only explicable by the motive to avoid the straightforward way mentioned in the law. And that is then not sufficient not to trigger the if clause, because then everybody would say, well, you sold a book. The only thing you avoided was the procedures and the names for it, but the final effect was a sale. Tax abuse is astonishingly not punishable. Everybody has the right to strange behavior. If I want to be a nice guy, I can say I don't sell books, I just give them away for free, but only for people who donate me 10 euro. Okay? As long as I communicate that clearly to the fiscal authorities, that's not a lie, and everybody trained in the application of tax laws will know, okay, making a gift under a condition that one gets a gift in return that is the same as selling. So we apply the rule that a sale has happened and we inform that person you owe us 7% of the value of what you got as value-added tax because you sold a book, although you did it in a different way. That is the important difference between avoiding a law by not fulfilling the condition and avoiding the form of the condition, but fulfilling the condition in reality just by another way. Yeah? So tax abuse is not a criminal offense, it is just taxed as if you had chosen the straightforward normal way. Naturally, from time to time, there will be discussions with the fiscal administration if the way you chose is indeed the same thing materially which is named in the law, or if it is really something different. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is sometimes case for the courts, and very often people then ask you what your motives were for that strange behavior, and if you can bring forward something which is really convincing, which has nothing to do with which to avoid a tax, then one might say, okay, we believe that was something completely different. It is similar to a sale, but it was not a sale. For example, if you make a present to somebody who also makes you a present, you usually would say that's just avoiding the word sale. You would not say that if it's Christmas and the people to whom you give a present in the expectation they give a present to you, if these people are members of your family or close friends, because everybody knows that is what happens on Christmas. So one would not say that was a behavior to cover up a sale and to avoid the word sale. Everybody would say, yes, that was genuine behavior, normal at Christmas. Legislator knew that people give or exchange presents at Christmas. Legislator didn't know and didn't mention that in the VAT Act, so it was not meant. On the other hand, if you do the same thing with strangers in June, then everybody would say, okay, only motive which we can imagine is naturally the motivation to avoid the word sale. So there is no difference apart from the formalities between that event and the sale. Good. Seems to be clear. Context as an argument and systematic background. Okay, that is sometimes also an argument. For example, in the field of value-added tax, there has been in history a famous case where a farmer got a subsidy from the state for doing nothing. Now, value-added tax is meant as a tax on consume indirectly, and so doing nothing and getting paid for that from the state, where in the end never a consume could happen, was in one case an argument to say that cannot have been meant by that law as rendering a service which would be taxable. Good. Historical intentions, I have already mentioned that. Here is just a small overview about that. Yeah? And sometimes historical background counts. For example, when it comes to the interpretation of what does the German Constitution mean by allowing that the state can levy a tax, then somebody said at that time already what was meant by the word tax was defined in the Abgabenordnung, or the Abgabenordnung of that time, the predecessor of today's Abgabenordnung. And so what all the people writing the Constitution had in mind when they wrote down the word tax was evidently what 3AO or the predecessor of 3AO meant and defined by the word tax. So courts would probably say that is the only thing where we can determine the meaning of the word tax if it was used in 1949, and so they would do this. Okay, here I left something out. The aims also play a role. The aims of a law, for example, are very important when it comes to interpreting European law, ladies and gentlemen, because European law has texts written in all the member states' official languages, so 24 or 23 different versions of one text. And you know by definition these 23 or 24 texts must have the same meaning, exactly the same meaning. And then debating about nuances of the expressions makes no sense. Here, the aims of the law have a higher role in the interpretation, because here the situation is also different. When it comes to a national law, let's say of Germany, you can say 500 people voted on that text, and all these people were familiar with the German language, and they knew the difference between a residence and the residence. Now, when you come to European Union law, you have some 500 or 750 people voting on the text in the European Parliament. Nobody of them is able to understand all the nuances of one of the language translations, the language versions. Everybody can only understand his own language version, and so if they voted with a yes for the text, for the draft, you cannot reasonably assume, out of respect for the members of parliament in that case also, you cannot assume that all these people knew every detail of the text and understood and fully endorsed every detail or nuance of what a certain expression might trigger as idea in the heads of the reader. So there, deciding about different interpretations plays a far bigger role. There to decide the aims are far more important. Huh? Good. Yeah, then naturally, if all these methods lead to argument, to the possibility to interpret differently, then you must in the end go to court and have a neutral person decide who has the better arguments. Huh? So, and that is something which naturally we should talk about afterwards.